Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Before we get started, if you hear any snuffles or snorting in the background, it's because working from home I'm now joined by my dog and he is not that impressed that I'm making videos every day. However, today what we're going to do is have a look at setting in Luther, so let's get started. What I've done is split down the settings that you see through the first episode. Some of the settings I've had to add in after I made my initial notes because if you are not aware, I did mention it in the previous video, when you're watching Luther, if you choose to watch it through Netflix, there are several scenes that are missed out. And so the hospital setting, for example, at the very beginning of the episode where we see Luther in the psychiatric facility, that's not included on Netflix. And it was only as I was watching it the first time around that I was like, hang on a minute, I'm pretty sure I made notes on those in the case study. So if you are watching Luther, if you're making notes on Luther, I would advise that you watch the BBC version because that appears to be the full version, and it also means that you can watch it for free as long as you've got that TV license. So head over to iPlayer so that you can get the full episode. Alright then, so we start the episode off with the disused warehouse. Obviously we see it at night and so it looks very foreboding through the low angle shot. Interestingly, we see it again later on and it doesn't seem quite as scary in the sort of light of day, but obviously we only get a very, very quick look at that during that morning period. It seems very sinister at night through the fact that it's disused. Obviously this creates enigma because we don't know who's going to be inside or who's going to be in the shadows, and it also foreshadows some of that narrative through the debris that we see when Madsen runs across the walkway. We then have the hospital setting. This creates a further connection between Luther and Madsen because they're both in the same hospital setting. So you see, I believe you see Madsen you see Luther first in the psychiatric hospital and then you see Madsen later on. Either way, they have a very similar corridor, they have very similar rooms. Obviously it's sort of hospital lighting and very sort of plain. There's not too much colour involved in there, so it creates this sort of bright atmosphere but kind of dull and muted at the same time. So this obviously creates a connection between the two characters further, even though obviously the first episode we don't get a lot from Madsen in that episode other than the opening scene. It subverts the expectations of protagonists like Luther. We would expect our police officers not to be in places like that psychiatric facility because we expect them to be clear and level-headed when they're answering or following a case. So it sort of subverts the expectation that we have of these characters. We also have this cyclical narrative provided because we see Madsen right at the very beginning of the episode in the hospital bed. We then see him right at the end and he's one of the final shots that we have. So it means that we get a sort of cycle where the narrative begins and ends in the same place. Alice's house then, when I'm talking about Alice's house, I mean sort of like the family home. And so the house itself looks quite old and quite traditional. It's not as extravagant as you might expect from the outside, but we've got to remember that the ground is what I meant there. The ground is clearly very large. It's located within the suburbs. And we've got to remember it's still in London, so it's clearly got to be in a fairly wealthy area of London in order for there to be this much ground located with the house. And so this obviously suggests that the family are quite wealthy. In a sense, this sort of conforms to and subverts the expectations that the audience would have all at the same time. So in a way, it conforms what we think because we would expect wealthier members of the sort of population to be targeted for crimes, but equally we wouldn't expect those wealthy individuals to perhaps be committing the crimes like Alice does. Now, inside the house, there's this sort of emphasis on normality of the family. So the family seems very normal, very relatable. We do also have evidence of Alice's intelligence, but I'm not going to go into that into too much detail at the moment because I'll pick that up in more detail when we start looking at props. police station we head to next. It seems very run down, very dull, very muted from the outside. There's nothing to really glamorize the fact that these are the good guys. Now, one of the things that the audience might be comparing Luther to are shows such as CSI or other American crime dramas, and in that they seem to have very extravagant locations. The sort of interview rooms, which we'll have a look at in a minute, seem to be much brighter, far more modern. We don't seem to get that in Luther. So again, I suppose makes it more realistic at the same time. It doesn't seem particularly welcoming from the exterior, but inside, and when I'm thinking of the inside, I'm thinking of that sort of scene, which again is one of the scenes that was cut out in the Netflix version, where Luther comes in and is welcomed back by the whole team. That open plan area sort of seems like the whole of his team is working together very, very closely, that this police sort of department is a very close group. They seem to get on with each other. They welcome Luther back with open arms, and so it suggests that they're all working together. And that would perhaps resonate more with people who work for the police and who are in the force, because you do have to have this very close bond with your colleagues when you're doing a job like the police do. Zoe's office, by contrast, seems more modern and more welcoming because it's lighter, it's brighter. We have these sort of transparent walls or partitions which are made up of glass, and the elevator's made up of glass as well and is sort of on the exterior of the building, which suggests that Zoe's work isn't as covert or as mysterious as Luther's is, but it also provides an element of irony, because although there's an element of transparency suggested by the walls, actually she's keeping a lot of things from Luther, whereas he's being very open and honest with her. Luther's office, on the other hand, seems very large, shows his importance because he's got this large office, but it's also very orderly and formal, so very dark wood. We've got a lot of the sort of recognisable conventions for a crime drama and for a sort of police detective's office. This sort of contrasts what Luther's personality is like, because he's not very orderly and he's not very formal on the outside or the way that he conducts himself. It's also shut off from anyone else, which shows his isolation, but unlike Teller's office, which we'll have a look at in just a minute, Luther's door seems to remain permanently open, which means he sort of keeps himself to himself but doesn't stop anyone from getting close to him and doesn't stop anyone from sort of seeking him out if they need to. Now, the interview room was quite interesting, and I might well do a separate video on that interview between Alice and Luther at a later date. But the interview room really does subvert the expectation that we have as an audience, because it seems very dark and very dull. So it acts a little bit more like a prison cell, which obviously sets up and foreshadows this idea that Alice is responsible for the crime. It's also not glamorized, and this is sort of the main difference, I suppose, between British crime drama and American crime drama. The interview room isn't modern, it isn't technological, it isn't very bright, it isn't welcoming. When you think of things like CSI, it always seems to have that sort of two-way mirror and that sort of stuff, which we didn't get in Luther here, and in fact it's very minimal. So there were very few props, no exterior settings, because you can't see through the window to see where exactly they are, so it makes the characters who are inside there, and I suppose the audience to an extent as well, makes them seem quite trapped. Now, Teller's office is smaller than Luther's, so despite the fact that she's higher up than him, her office doesn't seem as large, which is quite unusual, but also shows that in terms of the show as a whole, she's not as important as Luther, and we wouldn't expect that given that the show is named after him. It's also very similar in terms of decor, so again, very dark wood, very orderly, very formal, so perhaps drawing a similarity between the two and showing how intelligent Luther is and how he acts as somebody who perhaps is or could be higher up like Teller. Now, the blinds in Teller's office are drawn across the windows, and the door seems to be shut more often, particularly when she's talking to her boss, which obviously suggests that she's trying to keep people out, and suggests as well that the audience, when we're watching things happening in her office, are getting more exclusive information and are getting things that the other characters aren't privy to. So we get this element of dramatic irony here. Now we get quite a few transition shots which are normally used to show the wider London setting. They also, obviously, as transitions do, imply a change of scene, a change of focus from one character to another, or a change in time. And we get the change in time illustrated more so through Luther because we tend to see the city at night rather than in the daytime to show that there is a change in time. However, they can also become linked to a character. So for instance, we see this transition shot every time we move to looking at something to do with Alice. So whenever we move to see Alice's perspective, to see something significant happening with Alice, to see a meeting with Alice, we always get this transition shot. So it becomes sort of a visual clue that we're going to get something to do with a character when we see this particular transition. Now, Alice's apartment is initially very relatable and normal. So when we first see her coming into an apartment after she's been questioned by the police, you get a view sort of from the back of her kitchen looking at her front door, and it seems quite normal, quite relatable. But as she moves into her apartment as a whole, it seems very clean, very clinical, very modern. There doesn't seem to be any sort of clutter anywhere, which I suppose would come into props as well, but sort of implies that it's not as homely. Now, another thing that we need to bear in mind is that this has to be a large apartment. We don't see all of the rooms that are in her apartment. We don't see the bathroom. We don't see her bedroom. So the fact that they must be somewhere indicates that this must be quite a large apartment. And because it's so large, that then must reflect her wealth, because remember, they are in central London here. Zoe's house then seems like a quieter part of London. Again, when we look at it from the outside, I suppose we could class it as a townhouse, so again indicates a level of wealth, which links again Zoe and Alice. We could also class it as potentially partially suburban, again, which would suggest a link between these two. We also get a bar setting where Luther goes after his meeting with Zoe, and where Reed meets up with him. Now, initially this seems more Americanized, because when we think of pubs within crime dramas, we tend to think of them being quite crowded, maybe a little bit mucky. They tend to sit at sort of tables, the characters sit at tables and sort of discuss what's happening rather than sitting at the bar. So being at the bar makes it more American or Americanized, but from the outside it's very stereotypical and conventional to the genre as a whole. And finally, we get this lockup, the evidence lockup. Now, that should be a secure location. Unlike Luther, you shouldn't be able to just walk into lockup, rifle through all the evidence boxes, pick out a piece of evidence, take it out of the bag and use it, because evidence has to follow a particular process so that when or if it's needed at court, then both the prosecution and the defence can see that it's not been tampered with, and that it sort of adds to this whole sort of fair trial thing. So you shouldn't be able to do what Luther does in this episode, but it is conventional for the genre, and because it's meant to be this secure location, it gives this element of exclusivity to us as an audience. We feel like we're getting a look at something that we're not normally meant to look at, or we're not normally given access to. So all in all, sort of again adds to this element of dramatic irony, or makes us feel like we're getting something more when we watch Luther. Hopefully that was helpful. Slightly more key terms now. I hope that you guys are finding these useful. I am, as I said in previous videos, going to try and post as often as I can while we're not at school. I will have to go into school and work at some point, so if I don't post a video, that's probably why. If you haven't already though, please subscribe, hit the button below. If you hit the little bell icon next to it, you'll get instant notifications every time I do post a new video. Obviously, while you guys are not at school, you can be using these videos to help you with your knowledge, with your revision. You can pop comments or questions in the comments section. You can get in touch with me through Twitter at media_revision, and I'll do my best to help you guys in any way, shape or form that I can. Please, 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 while you are off school, be respecting those social distance rules that the governments have asked us to do. It is for everybody's benefit. Even if you feel fine and well, you could still pass the virus on to somebody else. So stay safe, follow the advice, and I'll see you guys later for another video.